You might have come across this graph before. It's a model for flow state, a theory developed by researcher Mihalyi Csikszentmihalyi, whose name I can spell from memory now. And it gets a lot of attention when we're talking about designing difficulty in games. But what is flow state? It's something we've all experienced before. Flow is that beautiful state of mind where you're perfectly present and engaged with what you're doing. The task at hand is stimulating, but not anxiety-inducing. Comfortable, but not boring. Musicians, readers, gamers, painters, programmers, and even, I'm told, runners experience this state of mind. And Csikszentmihalyi goes so far as to call it the secret to happiness in his TED Talk. So it's probably something that's worth paying attention to, especially if you're developing a game. Looking at the graph, along the horizontal axis, we increase the skill of the person doing the task. Along the vertical axis, we increase the difficulty of the task. The diagonal beam in the middle is called the flow channel, and that's where the skill and the challenge are basically matched. It's so simple to design for this. It's just a line. You start the challenge as easy, and then they get harder, and then people get better, and then they have fun. Right? I'm Dryden Thomas, and I have taken on the impossible task of designing a game called Lighthoof. It's got ricochet dashing, elemental magic, and a weird progression system. So if that sounds interesting to you, please take a moment to go over to Steam and wishlist it. There's a link in the description. There's a demo coming soon, and I am just so excited to share it with you. Okay, back to the graph. I do think it's a really useful graph. It's a nice graph. But the real world of game development presents problem after problem of trying to apply this. Let's start with problem number 1. People don't start at 0 when it comes to skill. This is probably the most obvious issue we face. The history of game development, and really all art, is iterative. That means we're constantly looping over past ideas, mutating them, adding new combinations of mechanics with new visuals or game feel. Very few players experience that development linearly. For example, I didn't play any first-person shooters growing up. The first one I got into was Destiny as an adult, because it had cool-looking space magic. So as a result, I was a burden to every team I was placed on. But even I wasn't starting from nothing. See, I had hundreds of hours of Skyrim, which let me know how to move around in first person and aim. From there, I could slowly pick up the skills I was lacking. Problem number 2 is that many skills can be in play at once. Games can demand a lot from players. You need to be able to read situations, develop a plan, and execute on that plan. As you divide up those big categories of skills further, there's more chances to find something that falls through the cracks and makes it harder for you to enjoy a game. In a platformer, you have to have positioning, timing, judging arcs, judging distances, and sometimes understanding momentum. And there's so much more. Other games might demand patience, creativity, knowledge of synergies, an eye for suspicious walls, situational awareness, or strategy. And you might have to employ them all at the same time, meaning that this linear graph of flow is now separated into several graphs of flow, complicating the situation. And the third problem is that people have different rates of growth for skills. A difficulty curve that works really well for one person might work terribly for another. Some people are going to need more practice on specific skills, and other people would get bored of repeating the same skill over and over. If you're watching this, chances are you're an adult who's into gaming, and you're probably picturing that one time you tried to get your non-gamer friend into a game that you love. But keep in mind that games are often designed for actual children. There are all kinds of coordination skills, logical skills, and even reading and verbal comprehension skills that kids just haven't developed yet. I'm an oldest brother. I've been past the controller to get through the hard part. And then there are all sorts of cognitive or physical disabilities that could make building up any given skill much more difficult or even impossible. With 1 in 6 adults experiencing some kind of disability, listening to their individual needs and designing accommodations to increase access is a necessity. One of the many ways that this intersects with game design is in a game's relationship with challenge. If you'd like to learn some more about that, there's an amazing publication called Can I Play That I will link to in the description. Okay, so those are some of the issues at hand. What are some of the solutions? Well, the first one would be a strong onboarding. For players who come into the game with different levels of skill, it's important to design the beginning really carefully. To some extent, every game needs a tutorial. Maybe it's like the famous World 1-1 of Super Mario Bros., which teaches you about bad Goombas and good mushrooms without saying a single word. Or maybe it's explicit, like in the copious text boxes of Xenoblade Chronicles. Designing tutorials could be the subject of a video all on its own, but in my opinion, a well-designed tutorial should do two things. First, it should assume as little prior knowledge as possible from its player. And two, it should stay out of the way of the fun of the game for experienced or returning players. Too often, developers, being obviously avid gamers themselves, will forget to put themselves in the shoes of a new player and assume things are self-explanatory when they definitely aren't. If you need any further convincing on that, Razbuten has an amazing series called Gaming for a Non-Gamer, which I'll link in the description. I also think maybe we've spent a little too much time idolizing the elegance of the World 1-1 wordless tutorial. Wow, that was really hard to say. Some systems are just complicated and need to be explained. It's awesome if the tutorial can be fast, fun, and engaging, but I have this sneaking suspicion that the negative experience of being overwhelmed or confused is far more common than the ecstatic bliss of realizing you've been taught something without words. Another cool way to build skills is with something I call a playground. I don't know if anyone else calls it that. I googled and I couldn't find anything, so I will temporarily take credit. Playgrounds give you a safe place to practice skills without any risk. Mario games have been especially good at this. In Super Mario 64, the Castle Grounds lets you run around, experiment with the camera, practice climbing, swimming, jumping, and more. All in a place where it's hard to die, and even if you drown yourself, you don't lose anything. It's a brilliant way to build skills from zero, and it was especially important for this release, since it was going to be so many people's first exposure to 3D movement mechanics. The brilliance of this design is that if you don't need it, you can just walk on by. Unskippable, intrusive tutorials can really put a damper on your desire to replay a game. Okay, so introducing skills is one thing, but then we've got to talk about building skills in gameplay. Game designers get to play the role of teacher, and the syllabus is the game. Most students, just like most players, will know how to do some pretty cool stuff by the end of the class. But you have to be smart about how you lay out the coursework. Tests of skills should start easy and get harder, which is life-changing information, I know. But difficulty can come in a lot of forms, and this is what I like to think of as modulators. So here's a list of modulators that I've come up with, keeping in mind that not every modulator will work for every kind of skill and every kind of game. The first modulator is quantity. 2 jumps are harder than 1, 10 jumps are harder than 2. 2 slime enemies are more difficult to fight than 1, even if it's just by a little bit. Then you've got velocity. Less time to think and process increases difficulty. This could be a reaction time thing, but even slower paced games could apply this. When you're just starting out playing chess, you don't want to play blitz chess or bullet chess where you get 3 minutes to do all of your turns added up. You need that time to evaluate and learn from all the board positions. Precision. This is all about changing the margin of error. In a platformer, you might have smaller spaces that you have to dash through or smaller platforms to land on. In a rhythm game, maybe this looks like less forgiving timing windows for inputs. Then we've got punishment. The more you lose by failing the check, the harder the check is going to seem. And that's whether you're talking about losing health, progress, or some other resource. In Celeste, you lose almost nothing for dying, which means the other modulators can be pumped up to the max. In early Pokemon games, you'd lose half of your money for letting all your Pokemon faint. I'm not sure if that still happens because I don't think I actually lost a Pokemon battle in Violet, due to the raw, unfiltered power of Tinkaton. Then we got complexity. The more information a player has to process to decide what to do, the harder the decision is. This could be on the player's end or the game's end. On the player's end, the more options you have to engage with something, the more difficult that decision is to find out what's optimal. A system where you only have to choose between attacking and blocking is much simpler. On the game's end, you can modulate the complexity too. Offering a ton of information can make even a simple A or B decision turn into a total nail-biter. Speaking of information, not having it can be just as hard. Ambiguity is another way to raise challenge levels. This obviously applies to puzzle games, where a player figuring out how to close a gap in their knowledge is the core of the gameplay. But taking information away can be done in other ways too, like in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom's Depths, where darkness hinders your exploration. Or how about in Rogue Legacy 2, where a trait that hides enemy health bars rewards you with extra gold for taking on that challenge. Scarcity. In resource management games, especially in survival, you have to be very careful with how you use resources like food, fuel, or ammo. But this applies to more abstract resources too. Health, stamina, cooldowns, or even space itself can be a resource that, when restricted, makes the game harder. Or how about the psychological or emotional factors? Intimidation is another modulator. An enemy or environment that looks or sounds scarier will raise your stress levels and become more difficult, even if it's mechanically identical to an easier looking challenge. Just putting spikes all over the place, even if it's off the critical path, will psych out a player. And imagine Hollow Knight's Deepnest without the horrifying scratching noises or the barely tonal fragmented music. It might not be so bad. And last of the modulators that I could think of was variety. Having to use different skills in sequence or simultaneously is the final step. If a pattern gets established, breaking it will also throw the player for a loop. To create a perfect difficulty curve, we might imagine taking any given skill and affecting it with all possible modulators, adding a little bit at a time. We could even rotate through different modulators at the same challenge level. This would give the player a lot of practice, but keep that practice fresh. So those are some tactics for modulating difficulty, but what are some of the overall strategies? The first one would be rewarding the use of skills. In the early game, you might be able to give some optional ways for more experienced players to flex. In Celeste, there are these strawberries that are completely optional and don't benefit you in any way except to say that you got them. So players new to the genre or the game might not be interested in going after them on a first run, but experienced players can get a nice brain buzz from doing it. Some games encourage you to engage with the mechanics by giving you a grade at the end of a battle or a level. This can work and be very motivating, but it can also be really annoying if you don't understand where the grade is coming from. Imagine writing a paper and then you just get back C with no further explanation or suggestions. That's not going to help you write a better paper next time. Here's a tricky one though. A lot of games reward players using higher skill with advancements and power. This is motivating because players almost always want power. I mean, I want to see the number go up, right? But as a result, the game gets easier for the people who need the game to be harder and vice versa. If you do the reverse though, players get punished for playing well. It might keep them in the flow channel if they don't notice it, but if they do, that's pretty annoying. Maybe keeping the rewards separate from the gameplay, like the strawberries in Celeste, is a better option overall. Or you could consider making them cosmetic items. Some games don't need to modulate difficulty at all because the difficulty is in your opponents, the other players. Once you learn how to play, you can play against people at your skill level. Luckily, determining someone's skill level at a game is an extremely straightforward process, which is why matchmaking algorithms are perfect and everyone loves them. The other challenge then is balancing the game itself. Some games have a lot of symmetry where the opponents have basically the same tools and goals. Those games, like chess, are a lot easier to balance, although you still run into problems like the first move advantage in chess. But then there are super asymmetrical games like Overwatch, where individual characters can have very different abilities, and the different teams might even have different objectives like attacking versus defending a space. These games can quickly develop metas, strategies that overthrow the skill hierarchy in favor of specific combinations of characters or techniques. Devs spend the entire lifetime of the game studying data, making tweaks, and then watching the ripple effects play out through the game. And this is made worse by the fact that different strategies dominate at different skill tiers of the game. Do you balance for the casual players who have trouble aiming at a flying rocket launcher and are pocket doctor? Or do you balance for pro players that have found the skill ceiling of the game and run the risk of monotonously running the same strats because they win 0.5% more of the time? It is not a design problem I envy, I can tell you that much. A third way to manage the difficulty throughout the game is through skill checks. Not the kind that you roll for in Baldur's Gate or Disco Elysium, but more like little exams throughout the game. These come in hard and soft varieties. A hard skill check is like a wall. Unless you know how to jump and then dash, you will not be going further in the game. A soft skill check would be more like the bosses in Hades. I tend to think that Meg is a pretty solid fundamentals check. It's tough to get past her without having a good grasp on reading animations to know when to dodge, basic positionings, and finding openings to attack. Theseus and Asterius test higher level skills. Can you set up a build with some good synergies and capitalize on them? Can you prioritize targets? Can you monitor more than one threat at a time? If the game is well designed, sending you back to the start will give you more time to practice the skills that you need to succeed in the next area, where you will likely be layering in more and more complicated skills. Another option to meet players at their skill level is difficulty options. If you want a player to have an experience that's challenging, but not overwhelming, but you don't know who the player is or what their skill level is, why not just let them decide for themselves in the settings menu? This is an approach that's so popular that when games don't do it, it becomes a big part of their identity. That's right, I'm talking about Animal Crossing. But difficulty options come with their own problems. First, you are asking the player, a non-game designer, to balance an interlocking system of systems against each other that they may have no knowledge of, especially if it's before they start playing. Second, these settings are easiest to design when they involve manipulating a single variable, like enemy health, for example. This might result in fights so short that an easy mode player doesn't have the time to develop the skills that would let them experience flow state. For a hard mode player, fights could get longer without becoming more interesting. It's sort of like if you asked for a hard math test and you were given 600 addition problems. Very good difficulty options will look at the core skills required to play the game and ensure that whatever's being tweaked still relates to those skills. Back to Hades, the most important skills relate to avoiding damage. The assist mode, called God mode, gives you additional damage resistance each time you die. This is great design because you still have to practice all those skills, you just get more chances to do it each run. By the time you can finish the game on God mode, you're probably ready to do pretty well without it. On the hard mode side, developers can use the modulators that I talked about earlier to force out more advanced skill use. If aim is at the core of the game, maybe critical shots have a smaller hitbox to hit, which would be using the precision modifier. If resource management is really important to the game, maybe trees give you one less wood per tree, which would increase the scarcity modifier. Getting creative with higher challenge modes can keep your most skilled players engaged and in flow for longer. A fifth strategy is just to save the hard stuff. Some games save their toughest challenges for dessert, like the Pantheons in Hallownest. This works really well to ensure that new players can swallow your main course, but you run the risk of losing your hardcore players if you don't give them something in the early game to chew on. Or at least an appetizer for what's to come. Speaking of which, let's talk about some other considerations with higher difficulty. First, I feel like it's really important to respect your player's time. Difficult games are awesome, but I get really turned off when I feel like a game isn't doing this. This can manifest in a lot of different ways. One of them that we're probably all familiar with here is grinding. If the only reason I can't complete a hard challenge is because I haven't walked around doing menial tasks long enough, I'm probably gonna slip into boredom and put the game down. Similarly, if the game punishes my mistakes by making me go back and redo a bunch of progress, I'm not going to have as much fun. But all that can go away if you introduce enough novelty to the redo. After all, that's what the whole roguelike genre is, right? On the next run, you can try a new approach, and you never know what you're going to face or what powers you might pick up along the way. I've got one more point to make, but chances are if you've gotten this far in the video, you're getting something out of it. So please consider hitting that subscribe and like and ringing the bell stuff, because then you'll see my next video, and that'll be cool. I'd like to close by pointing out that this is only one way to look at game design. Lots of games succeed at what they set out to do without putting you into a flow state or really even building skills. Some games are just there to be relaxing, or tell a story, or provide an aesthetic experience, or fulfill a fantasy, or they're just something to do with your hands while you talk to friends or watch TV. Humans have different modes of play, and even though one of them is competition, that doesn't mean that the modes have to compete with each other. But for the more skill-based designers and players out there, I hope this video has helped deepen your understanding of game design's most difficult problem: difficulty itself.